It was a very creative way to get out of jail if you don't mind pain and suffering and the very real probability of death. What he did, well, he was in the county lockup. I don't think it would have worked quite as well in a prison, but he was in the county lockup and for a few months because he'd been dealing some kind of designer drug at nightclubs. And so what he did, you've seen on television or the movies how that there's a second floor in the jails, and then there's that rail just beside the walkway. And so he got up on the rail backwards, spread his arms out, and then just toppled over. He hit the floor, it broke his neck, and it did indeed get him out of county lockup, because the sheriff decided all of a sudden his sentence had been fulfilled, because if he kept him, then he had to pay for all the surgeries that were to come. So he was instantly released. I went to see him over here at Vanderbilt when they brought him for the neck surgery. I've known him all of his life. You know that shot they give you before they do the surgery that makes you just a little loopy? My guess is that they had to give him something a tad stronger than they would give most people, because of the buildup he had, a tolerance he had for various drugs. And so he was already somewhat loopy when we began to talk. And I don't think he has any memory of what he told me, but he was explaining to me about one prescription drug that if you get it and chew it, and then you spit it and the saliva into a hypodermic and inject it, what it would do for you. And as if I were going to do that. So I listened to him explain all about those things. I was in the room with him by myself. His parents actually were outside instead of inside the room. I remember the day they brought him home. I wasn't there, but we knew about it. I don't know how long the adoption process takes, but I know they got him when he was a couple of days old. So I don't know when they officially became his mother and father. I guess in reality when he was about 2 days old, but officially, legally, I don't know how long it took. A few months ago, I was visiting with them, and in the course of our conversation, I had just spoken that night, as a matter of fact, at their church. It was a Wednesday night deal. And it's part of what I talked about that night. A friend of mine runs let's just call it a place, over in Arkansas, where they take teenage boys who are drug addicts. And he told me that he had never had a boy come in there yet that didn't have a big hole in his heart. And typically it was a daddy hole, but sometimes it could be a mama hole, but some big hole in his heart. And this boy has struggled with drugs all of his life. Now, I call him a boy. He's 30-something years old now, but you understand, I can still, at my age, refer to him as a boy. And as we talked a little bit after service, his mom, adopted mom, but his mom, she'd raised him since he was 2 days old, said, I think that describes him. He has this big hole in his heart. He has never been able to deal with the fact that his birth mother had given him away. And so he had this big hole in his heart. And therefore he has this really bad attitude about her. Hold that right there. We're going to come back to that. That's not where we're ending that story. We're coming back to that story. We're talking about the Ten Commandments. And as we talk about the Ten Commandments, perhaps the hardest one is the one that's missing up there right now. The first one is, you shall have no other gods before me. Then no graven image, when you're going to worship some idol that you made. No use of God's name in vain. I understand John talked about that last week. I was speaking for a church over in Texas. The sixth one, thou shalt not murder. Number 7, not commit adultery. Number 8, don't steal. Number 9, no false witness. Number 10, that you shouldn't covet. And right in the middle of all that, they put this one: you should honor your parents. Now, it kind of seems interesting that you would put that there, because God made it one of the big 10. The Decalogue is sometimes referred to. The 10 words, it actually is what it says, but the big 10. And you look at that and go, God wants us to honor our parents. And yet we know that there's stories worldwide about parents that don't always do what we think parents should do. For example, some families in Thailand will take their little girls when they get 5 or 6 or 7, and they will sell them into prostitution. They want the money, and they're perverted men from around the world who will fly into Bangkok for little girls. We've heard stories one way or another about things that parents have done wrong. I remember once, several years ago, speaking on a thing called Jubilee. I don't know if any of you remember when Jubilee used to happen here in Nashville. And I talked about loving God like a good father. And a lady came out afterwards and looked at me and she said, you see, you guys don't really get it. For those of us who didn't have fathers that were very loving or very lovable, and you talk about God as being our father, it doesn't evoke warm, wonderful emotions within me. Within me, what it evokes is this just intense dislike. So can you refer to God as some other thing than a father? Because that doesn't carry a lot of good memories for me. And we hear about those stories. And then you run into this. Honor your father and your mother. As a matter of fact, it's the first commandment God ever gave with a promise. He said, honor your father and mother that things may go well with you. Oh, and he even indicated that you will live longer if you do that. Now, even with the stories of the bad parents, and we know that some exist, I think that worldwide most parents are not bad people. There may be some parents who've done some things that were dumb. I would fit into that category. Wouldn't anyone else here fit into that category? Have you ever, out of the clear blue, all of a sudden remembered some mean thing you said in front of your child years and years ago, but all of a sudden it's back in your brain and you feel so badly about it? But you can't go apologize to your child now because maybe he or she doesn't remember it and you don't want to bring it up, just in case that isn't in there. But you remember, I just really blew that. That was just totally stupid. I can't even believe I did such a thing. Because hopefully as we get older, we become wiser. It doesn't necessarily follow, but hopefully as we get older, we get wiser and learn a whole lot more about life. And then we look back and think about all the things we did wrong. So here's the command itself. Honor your father and your mother that you may live a long time in the land the Lord your God is giving to you. Understand that this was when they were headed toward the promised land, and that's the land he refers to in that particular passage, although it'll be quoted again over in the book of Ephesians by Paul and made applicable to us, even though we're not headed for that particular holy land. And you say, well, what does it mean to honor your parents? Well, it means to treat them with respect. As a matter of fact, quoting from netbible.org, one of my favorite sources among many, it says it means to give parents the respect and honor that is appropriate for them. It could be paraphrased to say, give them the weight of authority that they deserve. Next to God, in the Jewish understanding particularly, next to God, parents would be highly valued, cared for, and respected. So what does that mean? Well, in other places in the Bible, God will explain more about it like this. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8. Listen, my child, to the instruction from your father, and do not forsake the teaching from your mother. By the way, anybody else realize, did your parents get smarter as you got older? There's some of the things they say when you were very young, you thought, you're not hip. Well, I guess I'm not hip by saying hip because I'm not a word anymore. You're not cool, you don't fit. I mean, you just don't understand. Life has changed since the old days. I love it, the old days. I love the joke where the grandson says to the grandfather, were you on the ark with Noah? No. Then why didn't you drown? I love that. Because people look at it and go, you've been around forever, you're ancient. You just don't understand the real world that we live in. But as I got older, I discovered that some things where I thought my parents were really just out of it, actually was some of the best counsel and advice I gave as I got old enough to understand it in its context. So he says, listen to their instruction. Do not forsake their teaching. In Luke chapter 2, in verses 51 and 52, when he talks about Jesus and his earthly parents, Mary, of course, who had birthed him, Joseph, her husband, Jesus' adopted father, if you would, he went down to Nazareth with them. By the way, this is the story right after he had really upset them. This story in Luke chapter 2, just before this passage, is when they had gone to Jerusalem, and then they left. And it took them a day to realize that he didn't leave with them. He was about 12 at the time. And they couldn't find him. You say, how in the world could it take a whole day? Well, the men and women traveled differently back then. What would happen is the women would leave way ahead of the men. The men would leave much later and catch up in a couple of hours because they didn't have to stop at every gas station along the way. That's not in the text, but I inferred it. And so apparently they thought that Jesus was traveling with his mother because at 12 he was still young enough to do that. So Joseph thought Jesus was with Mary. Mary thought just the opposite because at 12 he also could be considered a man in that culture and therefore traveling with his dad. So each thought he was with the other, and it takes him a day to realize he's not there, and it takes him 2 more days to find him. Can you imagine the terror that went with that? I mean, if you lost your child and it takes you 3 days to know where he is again, would you not have your heart just torn from your body? plus. How we'd explain it to God. The boy you gave us, we lost him. So in addition to the pain that any parent would feel, also they had to face God. You say, why did that occur? I don't know all the reasons, but I can tell you one thing it accomplished. His mother would go through that same thing again a few years later, where for 3 days he would be lost, meaning that he'd been crucified, he'd been buried. She's gone through this before, but she found him at the end, and so would she in the second story. She would find him again at the end. So as they leave, as he gets back together with them, he went down to Nazareth with them. Catch it? I put it in red, not because it stands out in the text, but just to make the point, and was obedient to them. So even the Son of God was obedient to parents. Were they always right? No. No, we know some examples where they weren't. The first miracle Jesus ever will work will be in John chapter 2, when he's at a big wedding party and they run out of wine, and his mama looks at him and says they don't have any more wine. Basically, he tells her, this is not your business, and then he makes the wine because she's his mama. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. You say, if he's God, how did he grow in wisdom? When he became a human, when he took on our flesh to become one of us, he limited himself. There were certain things he did not know. There were certain things he could not do. For example, throughout his lifetime, as he lived in a human body, he never worked any miracle, not one by his own power. He worked it by the power of the Holy Spirit. And he would admit sometimes on occasion that he didn't know. Like when they asked him about the end of the world, he said, of that day and that hour knows no man, no angel. I don't know it either. Only the Father. So by taking our flesh, he took also our limitations. So how did he grow in wisdom? Part of it was being obedient to his parents. So in Ephesians 6, verses 1, 2, 3, the Apostle Paul would say the same concept. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. He's quoting from Exodus that we just read a couple of minutes ago. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. So I listen to them. I obey them. But I also provide them what they need. In Matthew 15, verses 3 through 6, Jesus is dealing with some of these legalistic people who would take the law of God to justify their actions that were completely contradictory to the Spirit of God. People, by the way, can still do that. Like, I'll find a loophole. I'll find a way to interpret this, and the way I do it then is completely contradictory to what God intended, but because I'm a legalist looking for a loophole, I can justify this somehow. Jesus replied to these people, and why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. That was an Old Testament law. If you curse your father and mother, you'll be put to death. Now this, I think, is a way to control the population. Because about half the kids would never reach adulthood if we still enforce that. What do you think? But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is, quote, devoted to God, end quote, they are not to, quote, honor their father and mother, end quote, with it, then you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. What he's referring to is this, that some of these people, rather than taking care of their mothers and fathers as they got older, took those resources and said that they had dedicated those resources to God. Because they dedicated those resources to God, then they certainly weren't going to use them to help their father and mother. And Jesus is saying, you missed the point altogether. You created a tradition that is invalid as far as God's Spirit is concerned. He goes on to say, you hypocrites. By the way, Jesus was always nice to sinners who knew they were sinners. Read it. Go to the New Testament. If they knew they were sinners, admitted they were sinners, he was unbelievably compassionate to them. The only people he was ever harsh to were people who thought they were not. Oh, you think you're so mighty? You're so righteous, you're so godly. These are the people he got tough with. And on this occasion, he said, you hypocrites. By the way, hypocrite means an actor. It's a person who really is one way but pretends to be another. You hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. When I was in college, we all tried to have some kind of a job on campus, if at all possible, to help pay the way. Now, this was a long time ago. This was in 1967, and I realize some people here can't begin to comprehend that. I think, if I remember correctly, what we got paid was $1.50 an hour if we worked on the campus doing some kind of a job there. The job I got originally was to pick up paper. I was the guy went around campus cleaning up what everybody else dropped. That was pretty boring, so I finally got the coveted job. I became a night watchman. That's right, our school was so small we didn't have real policemen and security guards. We had students who couldn't sleep. And so I got $1.50 an hour to actually do that, walk around campus. And we had shifts during the night. We'd walk around. I remember one night, it was a Saturday night, when a guy almost ran over us. He was coming out of the dorms. We didn't know him. He didn't belong on campus. And he was apparently drunk by the way he was weaving. And when we tried to flag him down, he floorboarded it and nearly ran over us. We dove out of his way. And I remembered his face vividly. I saw him when he went by, that evil cackling face of his. And as he went by, the next morning I visited a new congregation and he was the worship leader. And I thought about this verse. They worship, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. You do realize those are two different things. Listening is one thing, understanding is another. Listen and understand what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. You see, he was talking to a Jewish audience who believed they were defiled by certain things they ate if those things they ate were not consistent with the law of Moses, such as eating pork. He said it's not what goes into someone's mouth that defiles them, but what comes out of their mouth. That's what defiles them. And in this particular context, what was coming out of their mouth was, I know I should take care of my parents, but I'm not going to do it because I've dedicated this to God. He's saying the thing you say indicates what really is in your heart, and what's in your heart is no good. If you're going to honor your parents, then you take care of them. You give them what they need. You see, when we were babes in arms, our parents took care of us, or at least whether it was our biological parent or another. Our parents took care of us. They fed us when we didn't know how to feed ourselves. They changed our diapers when they needed to be changed. They helped us learn how to walk, and they picked us up every time we fell. And it may well be that as our parents age, there will come a time when that's exactly reversed. When we'll feed them because they are unable to feed themselves. When we change their diapers because they cannot clean themselves. When we pick them up when they fall. And he's saying, this is what I expect of you. Why? You are to honor them, which means not only do you listen and you obey, it means that you take care of them when they need to be taken care of. And as we age, that becomes a potential. So, what's the opposite? Look at this. In Exodus 21:15, and again in verse 17, look what he says about the way you treat your parents. Whoever strikes his father or his mother must surely be put to death. If you hit your mama, if you hit your daddy in the Old Testament, they would execute you. You never had the right to do that. Never, ever, not once. Look at the other one. Whoever treats his father or mother disgracefully must surely be put to death. Disgracefully? I can illustrate this with a couple of different Bible stories. But disgracefully means to treat lightly, to curse, to revile, to declare contemptible, to treat shamefully. I'll give you this example here. Look at this. It's not specifically talking about parents, but it explains what disgraceful is. Do not curse, in Leviticus 19:14, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. What? He's saying that you make fun of a deaf person because he or she cannot hear you. That's disgraceful. You put something in front of a blind person because they can't see it and it trips them. That's disgraceful. Basically what he's saying is you mock, you make fun of, you ridicule. God said, you're never supposed to do that. That's wrong. With anybody, whoever he or she is, in whatever situation they have. Here's another example, again, not about parenting, but it explains it. David is running from Absalom. Absalom is one of his sons. Absalom has been responsible for the murder of his half-brother, Amnon. He had him murdered because of the fact that that half-brother had raped Absalom's full sister, Tamar. And to make him pay, he had him killed. Of course, he was guilty of murder, so he had to flee. Finally, Joab, who was the general, convinced David to let Absalom come back into the country and not face the penalty of death, even though he had been responsible for murder. David gave the clemency. Absalom came back. He was a very charismatic young man. He finally won over enough of the population that they began to revere him rather than his dad, who was the king. He started a civil war. He intended to kill his father and take over the kingdom. David, caught off guard, not prepared to fight, runs. And as he's fleeing Jerusalem with the people who are loyal to him, as Absalom is taking over Jerusalem, as the battle rages, a man came along. Actually, he was there as David passed by with his entourage. This man pelted David and all the king's officials with stones. I want to tell you how courageous this is. David has been a warrior since he was in his early teens. Before he reached the age of 15, he once fought a lion, and all he had was a club, and he killed the lion. He had also once fought a bear, and all he had was a club, and he killed the bear. He was 15 when he killed his first man. Oh, he would kill hundreds of more. But he was 15 when he killed his first man, and that man was a giant, quite literally a giant, 9.5 feet tall. At age 15, David at the time culturally probably was about 5 feet even, somewhere in that range. And so it was pretty big deal to kill any man, but he killed a giant of a man. And later, in subsequent battles, he would kill hundreds and hundreds of men. He was a warrior. I think when you start throwing rocks and dirt clods at somebody who is this skilled in battle, you're an idiot. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and special guard were on David's right and left. He was throwing across the Secret Service, trying to hit this man. As he cursed Shimei, said, "Get out! Get out, you murderer, you scoundrel! The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul." Saul was the king before David. "In whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer." By the way, would you think this is a disgraceful way to treat a king? Even if it were true, is this a disgraceful way to treat a king? It definitely is. And that's taught throughout the Bible, by the way. Even in the New Testament, we're told to give unto Caesar those things that are Caesar. When we are told by Paul, we should pray for the rulers. And the rulers of the day were not good people. You see, there's always been a principle throughout the Bible that you respect authority, even if you don't like that person, even if that person should not be there. You respect authority. So he's shouting all these things. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. And the men with David said, "Let us remove his head," which, by the way, was not a euphemism. No metaphorical speech. They wanted to literally go decapitate this dude. David said, "Leave him alone. Let him go." When David defeats Absalom and he's headed back to Jerusalem, among the first people that run out to greet him is Shimei. I think that makes sense, don't you? I mean, he should run one direction or the other. He should either run out of the country or run and beg for forgiveness. He fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my Lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my Lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet the Lord my king." He says, "I did wrong. Forgive me." And David did. David forgave him. He never paid. You see, how does this work into a sermon about parents? It explains what disgraceful means. It's when you treat lightly, when you treat with contempt, when you put down this other person. Now, if you read about this guy, he felt that he had every right to say those things to David because he really believed that David was a murderer. He really didn't like what had happened to the house of Saul. All these things he felt, he truly felt. He was saying what was in his heart, but it was still wrong because it showed disgrace. It was disrespectful. It was contemptuous of the one in authority. By the way, anybody see any potential application of this to 2012 and presidential elections or county seat elections. The Bible is always respects authority. Always. It was one reason they went into Babylonia when the Jews were captured and carried into captivity. One of the reasons God said that they went, as Ezekiel 22:7, is because they have treated father and mother with contempt. One of the reasons he let the Babylonians whip the Jews and imprison them was because the Jewish people as a whole had treated their father and mother with contempt. You begin to get the impression that God's serious about this. It's a big deal to him. And look at Romans chapter 1. Paul will talk about how people have become evil. Look what he says. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he's talking about people now who have totally rejected God. So God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what they ought not, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. These are pretty bad descriptors, don't you think? They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. Can you imagine God putting that in that list? Look at all the things there that he says how bad they are, and he puts that right in the middle of it. They disobey their parents. He's putting that in with God-haters, insolent, arrogant, people who invent ways of doing evil. He puts that in that same list. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. So, this is major. Very major. So what about the bad parents? Because sometimes there are. Well, we are told, I'll read you a passage in a minute, but let me just stop here for a second. Let me go back to my friend in the hole in his heart. That his mom, technically his adopted mom, but she's raised him since he was 2 days old. That's his mom. His mom said, I believe that some of the struggle he had all of his life with drugs, and he still does to this day, is because he never could deal with the fact that his mother rejected him. I once listened to two ministers talk. One of them, well, the father of one of them was dying. And in the process of dying, and it would not be long, this particular minister talking to the other minister talked about all the terrible things that had happened to him and in his family when his father was young. He said, I'm quite sure my family is going to ask me to officiate at my father's funeral. Yet I have all these negative feelings about him. All this pain, all this hurt. What do I say when I bury this man? The wise counsel from the other minister was this: I don't have a clue. I feel the same way about my father. I don't know what I'm going to do when he dies. So we know that sometimes those things happen. We do. But try to understand them for the sake of your heart. You see, this is what I couldn't help my young drug addict friend understand. You feel rejected by this woman. But let's see if we can think about it just a little bit differently. By the way, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but every one of those 10 commandments, every single one of them, works on the way that we think. And it's amazing how that people, when they think differently, do differently. I'm going to give you a quick illustration that may not make any sense to you, but it makes all the sense in the world to me. If I've told you before, be kind and let me tell you again. This happened just a few years ago. It was a German study. It was a psychological study that took a group of people, gave them an equivalent of $100 US, and said, we want you to go over there and gamble it. And if you choose not to gamble, you instantly lose 60%. Almost all of them gambled. They took another group of people, gave them the equivalent of $100 US, and said, we want you to go over there and gamble it, but hey, if you don't want to gamble, that's fine. You can still keep 40%. Almost none of them gambled. Did you follow the math? It was the exact same deal. So why did the first group gamble and the second group not? It's called framing. What it says is it's the way you think about something, not just the facts in and of itself, but the way you see those facts. So to the first group, it was presented as a loss. If you don't gamble, you lose. To the second, it was presented as a gain. If you don't gamble, you when. And just that perspective, that perception changed everything. There were many years when I would say, well, we are the product of our experiences. I finally began to realize that that's absolutely not true. We are the product of the interpretation of our experiences. You can have two children go up in the very same home with the very same situation, and one turned out one way and one turned out the other way because they viewed what happened differently. Are you following what I'm saying here? Sometimes it's just a matter of reframing. It's a matter of looking at it differently. That's even a biblical concept, by the way. In Philippians chapter 4, we're told not to worry about anything. Remember that passage? Be anxious for nothing. But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, make your request known to God. You know what he just said? Reframe. If you're thanking God, you're looking at it differently than if you're not thanking God. Reframe. So, to my young friend, which I was never able to accomplish, it would be, okay, you feel rejected by your birth mother, although you have no idea who she is. Let's see if we can look at her a little differently. I don't know who she is either. But I do know this. She could have chosen not to birth you. She could have ended that pregnancy early on if she had so decided. Now, for those who believe that life begins at conception, if she had done that, you'd be in heaven. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Oh, and by the way, if you're sitting here saying, but I have done that, I have ended conception. Let me see if we can help reframe that just a little bit. Well, there are some people that I'm sure would go through an abortion callously. I think that's the exception, definitely not the rule. Based on my experience of interacting with women, most of them who decide to end a pregnancy do not do it from callousness, they do it from fear. Oh, I'm not trying to justify one way or the other. I'm just trying to understand. You get the difference in these two things? Just trying to understand. They were afraid either for themselves, or they were afraid for their families, or they were afraid for the child, about what kind of life he or she would have if they brought him into the world. And so their decision, some I'm sure do it callously, but I think most do not. It's why they sometimes struggle so much with it later. So she could have chosen to end the pregnancy and not have you, but she chose to have you. So why did she give you away? Is it because she didn't love you? She didn't care? Possible, but minutely possible. The much greater likelihood is that she feared that she couldn't give you what you needed, that she couldn't provide for you what you needed, and therefore that you had a better chance at life if some loving couple who desperately wanted a child but could not have one would take you, than if she herself tried to raise you. You see, her giving you up for adoption, very likely, extremely likely, is an act of tremendous love on her part. And if you say, but I would tell her, I want to be with you. I don't care how rough it might be. I choose to be with you. Then I remind you of these two things. Number one, you were not there to tell her. Which means that number two, she had to make that judgment based on what knowledge and information she had at the time. There's no telling how many times she's thought about who you are and where you are and what you do. So while you feel rejected by her, my strong guess is that she did what she thought was best for you. She didn't reject you in her heart. She gave you what she thought would be better for you. Do you think if my young friend could ever see it from that standpoint, it would change how he feels? Can you see that possibility? You're saying, so you advise people to abort. You advise people to give up their young. I'm not advising anything. I'm just trying to understand. So what if you grew up in a home with an alcoholic father? What drove him there? Oh, I'm not justifying alcoholism. It's a bad thing. But what drove him there? Could it have been, that's all he knew. Could it have been, I could give you 1,000 different reasons as to what it could have been. But what about somebody who did something terrible like abuse? It's much, much harder to understand, I agree. Much, much harder. But you know, as long as you vilify, it's almost impossible to forgive. And if you cannot forgive, you are chained for the rest of your life. And the frame from which you work is much more likely to bring you more pain rather than healing. Forgive them for your peace. If your parent was an alcoholic, forgive them for your peace. If your parent abused you, forgive them for your peace. Whatever they did. You say, but if I forgive them, then they'll get away with. Look, all of us have to face God. God has the ability to look in the heart. All I have the ability to do is to see what you do. And I have lived long enough to know that sometimes some of the things you do don't really reflect your heart. They reflect where you are at a given moment, not necessarily who you really are for your life. If that's not true, then I don't know how to help any sinner, do you? Oh, of which I am one. What about you? And honor them for their position rather than their character for your future. What do you mean? God said that it will go better for you if you do. God said you will live longer if you do. You say, well, what if I die at 27? Well, you probably would have died at 24. You're going to live longer in some fashion. I don't know how that all works. I just trust him. So I'm trying to understand him from my heart so I don't feel all this anger, rage, bitterness, or whatever it might be. I forgive them for my peace so I'm not chained to any bad behavior on their part. Honor them, because by doing that, I change the way I think. If I change the way I think, it ultimately changes the way I feel. That changes my life. I used to be a consultant for a chain of psychiatric hospitals. I've done a lot of things in my life because I never could hold a job very long, but I was a consultant for a chain of psychiatric hospitals. It's kind of an interesting job. They had 8 in their chain. And I would fly to one hospital or another, and I enjoyed the money. They paid pretty well. But I'd get there, and you can't go back inside the hospital without signing a paper saying that you'll never reveal what you saw or what you heard. Because there are people in there who are miserable and don't want to be there, and that's just the staff. One of these hospitals was over, well, I won't even tell the state, but one of these hospitals was in another state, and I flew into a major airport, rented a car, drove over there, and as I was working with them as a consultant, I noticed the slogan they had. They actually gave me a coffee cup. Somewhere are all the moves, we've lost it, but a coffee cup. And the same thing was on some of the walls around in different places, and what it said was, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And I thought that's one of the coolest things I've ever heard in my life. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. How am I going to have it? I'm going to honor my father and mother no matter what. No matter what. That changes my frame. I'm going to forgive if I need to. I'm going to love if I need to. Oh, and as my parents get older, my father is dead. Alice's parents are both dead. My mother's still alive. She's 88. I think she's 88. Hard to keep up. It changes every year. She's 88, she's still spry, she gets around, she still drives and goes to the beauty shop and things like that. I mean, and she still tells me what to do. Anybody else have a parent that still tells you what to do? And a young man went, do you honor her? Yes. When you talk to her on the phone, sometimes I hear the same story I've heard every other time I've talked to her on the phone. What do you do? Hey, Mom, I've heard this one. No. What do? You honor her. You let her tell it again. She can't remember whether she told me or not before. She's not Alzheimer's. I don't mean that. She's just gotten older. You know it. Many of you have already reached that when you've gone into the kitchen and thought, why did I come in here? It happens. I hope I never have to change my mother's diapers. But if I do, I will. Was she perfect? No. Oh, I could think of and tell you the stories of the things she messed up from my perspective, but why remember that? She gave her life for me. I shall honor her. What about you?
Let's stand as we sing together. Have thine own way, Lord.